The lawyer slid the folder across the table, looked at my son and said quietly, almost gently, "Did you actually read it? All of it?" My son didn't answer. He just stared at the pages like they were written in a language he'd never learned. I had. I'd read every word. I helped write it. Let me go back a bit. Not all the way. I don't have the energy for that anymore. But far enough so you understand how we got to that room. My name is Leonard. I'm 67 years old. I spent 31 years building a small but profitable commercial flooring business in Hamilton, Ontario. Not glamorous work, not the kind of thing that gets you featured in a magazine, but it was honest, and it was mine, and at its peak we had 23 employees and contracts across the Golden Horseshoe. My wife Margaret and I built that together. She handled the books for the first 15 years while raising our son Marcus and our daughter Diane. Margaret was the kind of woman who remembered every employee's birthday and still somehow never missed a deadline with the CRA. I don't know how she did it. Marcus joined the business when he was 26. Diane never wanted anything to do with it. She'd moved to Vancouver, married a man named Trevor, had 2 kids and seemed genuinely happy doing something with graphic design. That was fine. That was more than fine. I was glad she found her own path. Marcus was sharp. He learned fast. Within 3 years he understood the operations better than some guys who'd been with me for a decade. I was proud of him. I told him so. Maybe too often, in retrospect. Margaret got sick in the winter of 2019. Pancreatic cancer, the kind that doesn't negotiate. We had 8 months from diagnosis to the end, and I don't have words for what those 8 months were like, so I won't try. She passed in October, just after Thanksgiving. Marcus came to the hospital. Diane flew in from Vancouver. We were all there. 2 weeks after the funeral, Marcus sat me down at my own kitchen table and told me he thought it was time to formalize the ownership transfer of the business. I remember looking at him and thinking I'd misheard. He said Margaret had always wanted the business to stay in the family. He said I was 65 and grieving and probably not in the headspace to be making big decisions. He said the transition would be smoother if we got ahead of it now. Legally, before things got complicated. I asked him what he meant by complicated. He said things like probate, estate disputes, tax implications. He used the word clarity 4 times in about 6 minutes. He had a folder with him, printed documents. He'd clearly been thinking about this for longer than 2 weeks. I told him I needed time. He said, of course, absolutely, take all the time you need, Dad. He called me twice that week. Both times he circled back to the business. What I didn't tell Marcus, what I hadn't told anyone yet, was that Margaret and I had already updated our wills the previous spring before her diagnosis. During one of those sober, grown-up conversations you have in your 60s when you realize you're not planning for a distant future anymore. You're planning for something real. We'd worked with our lawyer, a woman named Sandra, who'd handled our legal affairs for 12 years, and we'd been very deliberate about how things were structured. The business was held in a family trust. Margaret and I were co-trustees. Upon her death, I became the sole trustee. The trust owned the business. Marcus did not own the business. He managed it, and he was compensated well for that. But there was a difference, a significant legal difference, between managing something and owning it. In the original arrangement, Marcus was the primary beneficiary of the trust upon my death, with the condition that he continue operating the business in good faith and maintain care of me during my remaining years. Housing, basic expenses, reasonable support. It wasn't punitive. It was just responsible. Sandra had suggested it. We agreed it made sense. But here's the thing about grief. It shows you who people are. The calls continued. Then they became visits. Then Marcus started bringing Trevor, that's his brother-in-law, now Diane's husband, into the conversations, which I found strange. Trevor had no stake in any of this. But Marcus seemed to want a witness, or maybe an ally. One afternoon, Trevor sat in my living room and told me, almost casually, that it would probably be wise to simplify the estate before things got complicated with the government. I didn't say much. I poured everyone coffee and I listened. What I did the next morning was call Sandra. I want to be fair to Marcus. I don't think he woke up one day and decided to be a bad person. I think he convinced himself that what he was doing was reasonable. He'd been running the day-to-day for 4 years. He knew every supplier, every contractor, every account. He probably genuinely believed the business was already his in every way that mattered. He just wanted the paper to match his reality. But what he didn't factor in, what he never once asked about, was me. Not in a financial sense, not what I needed, not what I wanted. Not once did he sit down and say, "Dad, how are you doing? What do you need? What does the next chapter of your life look like?" He asked about the assets. He asked about the transition timeline. He asked about the tax structure. He never asked about me. That told me something. Sandra and I met in January. I told her everything. The conversations, the folder Marcus had prepared, the visits with Trevor. She listened without interrupting. Then she asked me a question I hadn't been asked in months. "What do you want, Leonard? Not what's fair, not what the will says. What do you actually want?" I sat with that for a moment. "I want to know that I'll be okay," I said. "I want to know that I won't end up dependent on someone who sees me as an inconvenience." She nodded. "Then let's make sure of that." We spent 2 months reworking the trust documents. Sandra brought in a specialist, an estate planning lawyer from Toronto, who worked specifically with family business transitions. We were meticulous. Every clause was reviewed. Every contingency was addressed. The new structure worked like this. I remained sole trustee. Upon my death or incapacitation, the trust would pass to Marcus, but only if he had demonstrated in the 3 years prior a pattern of reasonable contact and basic support. Not extraordinary, not expensive. Just basic human decency. Minimum monthly contact. Assistance with medical appointments if needed. No attempt to pressure me into legal or financial decisions during periods of grief or health vulnerability. If those conditions were not met, the business and its assets, which at that point were valued at roughly $2.4 million, would be transferred to a charitable foundation we designated, a vocational training program for youth aging out of foster care in the Hamilton area. Margaret had volunteered there for 6 years. It mattered to her. It mattered to me. Marcus was still named in the will as executor of my personal estate. The house, the RRSP, the personal savings. That part didn't change. He wasn't cut out. He wasn't punished in advance. He was simply given a set of conditions that any reasonable son would meet without even thinking about them. Sandra looked at me across the desk when we were done and said, "You understand that if he behaves normally, none of this matters. He'll never even know these clauses exist." "I know," I said, "and if he doesn't behave normally, then at least I'll have an answer to a question I've been asking myself since October." Spring came. The pressure from Marcus eased off, which I took as either a good sign or a sign that he'd decided to be more patient. He came for Easter dinner. We watched the Leafs game. It felt almost normal. Then, in August, I had a procedure. Nothing dramatic, an outpatient thing for a kidney stone, and I called Marcus the evening before to let him know I'd need a ride to St. Joe's in the morning, since I wasn't supposed to drive myself home after sedation. He said he had a site visit in Brantford. He couldn't move. I said I understood. I called a neighbor. I didn't say anything to Marcus about it afterward. I just noted it. The way you note things that you hope you're wrong about. Christmas that year. He cancelled 2 days before, said something had come up with a contract in Mississauga. I had dinner alone with a frozen lasagna and a glass of Shiraz, and I watched a documentary about the Canadian Shield, and I thought about Margaret, and I thought about what Sandra had said. By the following spring, Marcus was calling maybe once a month, sometimes less. The calls were brief. He asked about my health the way you ask about the weather. Just enough to say you asked. He never visited, When I mentioned my blood pressure medication had been adjusted and I'd had some dizziness, he said that was probably just the dosage and I should drink more water. I drank more water. I called Sandra. What happened next unfolded over about 6 weeks, and it was both more dramatic and more quiet than I expected. Marcus had, at some point, apparently spoken to a different lawyer, someone who told him that family trusts in Ontario could sometimes be challenged on the basis of undue influence, particularly when the trust was modified after a spouse's death. I don't know exactly what he was told or what he planned to do with that information. What I know is that in early April, he came to my house with a document he wanted me to sign. He said it was a formality. He said it would simplify the transfer process when the time came. He said Sandra had probably overcomplicated things, and a fresh set of eyes would be useful. I looked at the document. It was a direction to transfer. Signing it would have effectively moved control of the trust to Marcus immediately, while I was still alive. I put it down on the kitchen table. I said, I need to have Sandra look at this before I sign anything. He said that wasn't necessary, it was standard. Sandra would just drag it out and charge me for the privilege. I said I'd have Sandra look at it. He left without finishing his coffee. 3 days later, Sandra sent him a letter. I don't know everything it said. What I know is that it referenced the trust documentation, referenced the conditional clauses, and informed him that any attempt to pressure the trustee into unauthorized transfers could constitute a breach of fiduciary trust and potentially trigger the charitable redirection clause. Marcus called me that night. His voice was different, tighter. He asked me what the charitable redirection clause was. I said he should probably read the trust document in full. He said he had read it. I said, "Did you read all of it?" There was a long pause. "Dad, what did you do?" I want to tell you I felt triumphant in that moment. I want to say I had some speech prepared, something Margaret would have been proud of, something about dignity and loyalty and what it means to be a family. Mostly I just felt tired. I told Marcus to come to Sandra's office on Thursday. I told him to bring his own lawyer if he wanted. I told him I wasn't angry. I told him I just needed him to understand what the document actually said. He came on Thursday. He brought his own lawyer, a young guy who seemed uncomfortable the entire time. Sandra walked them through the trust. All of it. The original structure, the modifications, the conditions, the redirection clause. When she got to the part about the charitable foundation, the vocational program, Margaret's organization, Marcus's lawyer asked how the valuation had been determined. Sandra said the business had been independently assessed at $2.4 million, plus the equipment and vehicle fleet, and that the trust owned all of it. Marcus was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "This isn't fair." Sandra said, "The conditions aren't punitive, Marcus. They describe a minimum standard of care that most families take for granted. Your father didn't ask for anything extraordinary. I've been running that business for 5 years. You've been managing it," Sandra said. "On behalf of the trust. That's what your employment agreement says." His lawyer leaned over and said something quietly to him. Marcus shook his head. He looked at me then. Really looked at me, maybe for the first time in a couple of years. "You could have just talked to me," he said. I thought about the kidney stone procedure, the Christmas lasagna, the coffee he didn't finish. "I tried," I said. "You were busy." The months that followed were uncomfortable. Marcus hired an estate lawyer to review whether the modifications could be challenged. They couldn't. Sandra had been thorough, the process had been clean, and I was of perfectly sound mind in January when the revisions were made, which my doctor could confirm. After about 2 months, his lawyer apparently told him there was no viable path forward. Then something shifted. Marcus called me in September, not about the business, just a call. He asked about my blood pressure. He actually asked, not the weather version. He asked what medication I was on, whether the dizziness had resolved, whether I'd had a follow-up with my GP. I told him it had mostly settled. He asked if I wanted company for Thanksgiving. I said yes. He came. He brought food. He stayed for 3 hours. We didn't talk about the trust. We didn't talk about the business much at all. We talked about when he was a kid and the time we drove to Cape Breton and got lost for an entire afternoon on a logging road because I refused to admit I'd made a wrong turn. He laughed. I laughed. It felt like something, though I couldn't tell you exactly what, since then, and it's been about 40 months now. He comes once or twice a month. He called when I had a follow-up appointment at the cardiologist and offered to drive me, and he did, and he sat in the waiting room for 2 hours without complaining. He texts occasionally. Not a lot, but enough. I don't know if it's genuine. I want to believe it is. I think Margaret would say that the sincerity of the change matters less than the change itself, that people grow into their better behavior and you have to give them room to do that. I'm trying. The trust still exists, exactly as Sandra wrote it. The conditions are still there. If things revert, they revert. And Margaret's organization will do something good with $2.4 million. But I don't think it'll come to that. Last month Marcus called me on a Tuesday evening. No occasion, no agenda. He said he'd been driving past the old warehouse on Barton Street, the one we'd had for 20 years before we moved operations, and it made him think of me. He said he used to pretend to sharpen pencils at the front desk when he was 7 so he could listen to me talk on the phone to clients. I didn't remember that. He said he remembered every word. I sat with that after we hung up, 67 years old, alone in a house in Hamilton, and I sat with that for a long time. I don't need to be king of anything. I never did. I just needed to know that I mattered to somebody. That I wasn't just an asset to be transferred, a problem to be managed before it got complicated. Margaret knew that. She always knew that. I think that's why, even at the end, she held my hand and not the paperwork. I'm still here. The business is still running. Marcus knows where I stand, and I think, slowly, he's figuring out where he stands too. Some things you can't put in a trust document, but the important ones, I made sure of those. I think about that Tuesday phone call more than I probably should. Marcus, calling for no reason, saying he'd driven past the old warehouse on Barton Street and thought of me. 67 years old, and something that small almost undid me. That's the thing nobody tells you about getting older. It's not the big betrayals that wear you down. It's the accumulation of small absences. The ride you didn't get. The Christmas dinner you ate alone. The follow-up appointment where nobody asked. Those things stack up quietly, and by the time you notice the weight of them, you've been carrying them for a long time. I don't think Marcus set out to be cruel. I've had a lot of months to sit with that, and I genuinely don't believe he woke up one morning and decided his father didn't matter. I think he just stopped paying attention. And when you stop paying attention to someone long enough, you stop seeing them as a person and start seeing them as a piece of a larger puzzle, something to be arranged, managed, resolved. That's a gradual thing. It happens without anyone deciding it. What I learned, what I had to learn, because I didn't know it at 65 the way I know it now, is that doing the right thing quietly, over years, is a form of strength that doesn't get enough credit. Margaret had it. She ran the books, raised 2 kids, volunteered on Tuesday evenings, and never once asked to be recognized for any of it. She just kept showing up. That consistency, that steadiness, that's not passivity. That's a decision you make every single day, and it requires more backbone than most people realize. I had to find some of that myself after she was gone, going to Sandra, asking the hard questions. Reworking the documents when every instinct told me it would cause conflict. That wasn't easy. There were nights I second-guessed all of it. Nights I told myself I was being paranoid, that Marcus would come around on his own, that I was creating a problem that didn't need to exist. But I kept thinking about what Sandra asked me. What do you actually want? And I kept coming back to the same answer. I wanted to know I'd be okay. I wanted to know I'd made a decision with a clear head, not out of grief or loneliness or the need to believe the best about someone who was showing me something different. That clarity, knowing what you actually want and being honest enough with yourself to act on it, is harder than it sounds, especially when the person involved is someone you love. Especially when admitting the truth means admitting something has gone wrong. But I think honesty with yourself is where everything else starts. You can't make a good decision from a place of wishful thinking. You have to see things as they are and then decide what kind of person you want to be in response to that. Not in anger, not in retaliation, just clearly and with as much decency as you can manage. Marcus is showing up now. I don't know exactly what changed in him, and I've stopped needing to know. What I know is that he drove me to the cardiologist and sat in that waiting room for 2 hours, and when I came out he asked the right questions. That matters, not because it erases anything, but because people can grow, and when they do, the decent thing is to let them. I'm still here. That's not nothing.